of the Center. Okay, this meeting's okay. On behalf of the Center for Chinese Studies at UH Manoa, I would like to welcome everyone to our Spring 2021 CCS seminar series. For your information, and as was announced just now, today's session is being recorded and the file will be uploaded to the CCS website, the link of which you will see right now in the chat forum box right to your right side. My name is Mingbao Yu from the Department of East Asian Languages, and I'm the organizer and moderator of this series, which we have been conducting entirely as a Zoom webinar since last semester. And this would not be possible without the formidable leadership of current CCS Director Yang Jihua, David Yang, Professor of Accounting from the Scheidler School of Business, and his hardworking and committed team of staff that includes CCS Director Ren Youmei, Dr. Cindy Ning, and CCS Program Coordinator Sun Jialing, Ms. Jialing Sun. During this session, if you have any questions or queries about technical or logistical issues, please use the chat forum, not the Q&A, the chat forum you see at the bottom of your screen that will be monitored and answered by Dr. Ning and Ms. Sun. Our complete program flyer for this semester is posted on the CCS website and Instagram, and I encourage you all to check it out because we have an impressive lineup of presentations. If you have been following our CCS webinars since last semester, you will have noticed that our series is different from other seminar or speaker series on this campus because our program showcases a variety of innovative and collaborative presentation formats, including last and this semester, 4 co-sponsored interdisciplinary and interregional faculty panels with the Center for Southeast Asian Studies that are part of a larger research project focusing on China and its relationship with Southeast Asia. Furthermore, this semester, we are also very fortunate to have secured the participation of Chinese study scholars from around the world, namely from California, the East Coast, Europe, and Taiwan. Today, however, we are staying on familiar grounds in Hawaii and UH Manoa. Our event today is a faculty dialogue between Erica Brindley, Professor of Asian Studies and History from Penn State University, and Wensheng Wang, Professor of History from UH Manoa. And it is co-sponsored by the History Department, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, as well as the International Cultural Studies Certificate Program on our campus. We would like to thank and acknowledge these 3 units for their support and cooperation. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our 2 distinguished speakers. Erica Brindley is currently on the islands because she's on sabbatical leave and visiting the UH History Department here at Manoa. Her research focuses on the cultural and intellectual history of pre-modern East Asia, which is roughly 500 BC to 500 CE, especially in the region she has called the Southeast Asian Maritime Zone. Her first 3 monographs concern ancient Chinese thought and intellectual history and explore the many ways thinkers envision the self and other in society and the world. Her first book, Individualism in Early China, Human Agency and the Self in Thought and Politics, was published by UH Press in 2010. Her second book, Music, Cosmology and the Politics of Harmony in Early China by the State University of New York in 2012. And her last book, Ancient China and the Yue, Perceptions and Identities on the Southern Frontier, 400 BCE to 50 CE, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. Her current project builds on her work on the Yue or the Viet and involves rethinking the networks that connected much of South China to areas in Southeast Asia, especially Vietnam. To that end, she has been fostering interdisciplinary discussions that will contribute to the history of this zone, as well as a better understanding of how South China was eventually over the millennia more fully incorporated into the Chinese realm. Wensheng Wang is an associate professor of history specializing in the late imperial China of the 18th and 19th centuries, with a focus on cultural politics, intellectual change and foreign relations, social movements, popular religions, and maritime interactions. He received his PhD degree from UC Irvine, and he's the author of the book, White Lotus Rebels and South China Pirates, Crises and Reform in the Qing Empire, that was published by Harvard University Press in 2014. Professor Wang is currently conducting research on the second book on the transformative power of Confucian ideology and its interactions with the Qing state before the Opium War. Professor Brindley's talk today is entitled Civilizing the South, Colonialism and Colonial Change in Ancient East Southeast Asia, and engages the extent to which imperial efforts were successful at civilizing the ancient southern frontier of the Han Empire. By focusing on several key encounters of Han Sinitic peoples with the local Vietic people in the ancient Nam Vien region, an area extending from modern-day Guangzhou to the Red River Delta in Vietnam, Professor Brindley argues that these encounters provide glimpses of the attempts made by the Han to pacify and assimilate the southernmost reaches of the empire. And in doing so, a closer examination of these encounters provide us an insight into the nature of early East Asian colonization and help to answer the questions of whether and to what extent military administrative institutions from North brought about cultural changes in the South. Professor Brindley will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then Professor Wang will provide some comments and engage Professor Brindley in a conversation before we launch into our Q&A session. At any time during the presentations, the audience is invited to use the Q&A forum at the bottom of your screen to send questions. So please remember to use the Q&A chat forum, not the chat forum, to send your questions, which we will monitor and present to our speakers after their presentation. And please don't wait until the very end to send your questions, because then we will run out of time to answer them. In order to accommodate everyone, we kindly ask that you please keep your comments concise and ask no more than 2 questions so that we will keep within the 30 minutes we have allocated to the Q&A session. We will try our best to take your questions in the order they have been submitted, but we might also synthesize or group together similar questions so that we receive a more focused response from our speakers and make room for other comments and queries. After today's presentation, we will send out a brief survey to our audience, so we would greatly appreciate if you could take a minute or 2 to give us some feedback. So without further ado, let me now turn over to Professor Brindley and her talk, Civilizing the South, Colonialism and Cultural Change in Ancient East Southeast Asia. Professor Brindley.
Thank you so much, Professor Yu. It's my honor to be speaking to everybody today. I know there are people from around the world, not just in Hawaii, and I welcome you, and I'm glad that the time zones fit so that you can be here today. I also want to thank the Department of History at the University of Hawaii for inviting me this year to engage with scholars, through, it turns out through the Zoom format, but on my sabbatical here in Hawaii. So this has been an opportunity for me to get to know all of you, and I hope that we can continue these kinds of conversations that get started even today further and into the future. So I'm going to share my screen now. Let me get the right one. Don't want to show family pictures here. Okay. This talk today is part of a larger project. It turns out originally I had wanted to do it on my own, and just in the last week, I was able to talk to a colleague down in New Zealand, Professor Catherine Churchman, and we've decided that we're going to collaborate on this project. So I'm super excited about it, so I hope some of that energy gets transferred into this talk today. But one of the big questions, wait, how do I go forward? Oh, here, sorry. I was trying to move forward on my screen. Some of the big questions that I'm interested in pursuing in this book project is the larger question that was posed to me about 20 to 25 years ago by a professor who worked on frontiers of China, Professor Jack Wills at the University of Southern California, when I was first starting out working on the Viet or the Yue peoples. And he was into a very interesting debate that people were starting at that time that was focused around the question of why is China so big? And it seems like a simple question there, but when you start delving into this question, it almost appears as though the history of China is a little bit anomalous in that you've got so much diversity around these surrounded and cohering in a sense around lots of different kinds of myths and jerry-rigging and things to make it kind of cohere, when in fact a lot of times it did not cohere, and a lot of times it's not appropriate to be talking about, especially in the early period, China as China. And so now it just so happens that Kenneth Pomerantz at the University of Irvine, oh, now he's at Chicago, is writing a book on why is China so big. And he was a guest at our last conference that we held at Penn State on what we're calling the SEAMS, or the Southeast Asian Maritime Zone. And he took lots of notes. So I'm hoping that a lot of the early period pre-modern things get written into that discussion as well. But in the meantime, I think that the other scholars who work on the ancient period will definitely be continuing this work. And so I really look forward to seeing all of the products of these conferences come out in the next few years, or in the next few decades. So the questions are large that surround this project. Why is South China China in the first place? Why is it not, Guangzhou country or the state of Shu, or the nationality of Ba or Minnan or something like that? There's so many different regions that could have become their own autonomous nation states. And so to actually delve into the reasons why they were eventually over, at least two millennia incorporated into the south of China is a very interesting question. Scholars used to answer this question in very flippant ways, or what seemed to be, because it's such a large question. So Victor Lieberman, for example, the Southeast Asian historian, when he talks about China, he basically starts to reifies what I would call some of the myths that have developed around this development in the south of China, and saying that the Chinese state developed superb homogenizing techniques. Well, that might be so over the long run, but at what time scales are we looking at? So part of my project is to try to complicate some of these approaches to the South and look at the Southeast Asian Maritime Zone, which I was part of, kind of the coiner of this term. I was working with two other scholars, Francis Allard and John Fan, a linguist and an archaeologist, on these conferences, and we came up with it together, and we now have a Facebook group that's called SEAMS, so I welcome all of you to join that. But the point of the SEAMS is to get away from not just nationalistic, kind of nationalistic versions of the past, and the attempts to kind of see the past through the present only, and the divisions that are here today, but to kind of get beyond the China Southeast Asia division as well, and show that indeed a lot of what we now call southern China could also be seen as the northernmost frontier of the Southeast Asian zone, so to speak. It's both Chinese and Southeast Asian in many different ways, and I think that that's lost oftentimes when we try to say, oh, we just want to learn about Vietnamese history, or we want to only learn about this, and we think of things in terms of nationalistic boundaries. So SEAMS, and this concept of SEAMS as a geographic climatic maritime zone of interaction really helps us get beyond those kinds of constructed boundaries. And in this zone, back in the period I'm looking at, which is more than 2,000 years ago and up until through the first millennium, we have so many different kinds of language groups, language families that are completely different from each other. And this will just give you a sense of the diversity of this region. Just in terms of Austronesian languages, which we think were probably relevant for the Southeast China area, or the Minnan regions of China, and especially Taiwan. This was the jumping off point, we think, for the great spread of the later the Polynesian peoples, but the Austronesian kind of super spreading migration, like one of the great aspects of world history. And so we've got Austronesian languages being spoken in the southern reaches of East Asia. We've got Kra-Dai languages, or you can call them, they used to be called Tai Kadai. And this is just a map showing where they're spoken even today. And you can, I would want all of you to imagine that this entire landscape south of the Yangtze River was just speckled with all of these kinds of languages. It would have been a much more widespread dispersal of these languages and language families. And these Austroasiatic languages today in Southeast Asia, all over Southeast Asia, they are the, a mainstay of continental Southeast Asia, and also Hmong-Mien languages spoken throughout Southeast China, but also extending down into Southeast Asia. So this is a kind of continuous region. It is a connected region, and it's a very false connection, a false distinction to say this is China only, and we only look at Chinese history, or we only look at Southeast Asian history. So I do have a background in Chinese studies, so it makes it hard to sometimes, get my mind, twist my mind around and think from a different perspective. But that has been a challenge, and I am benefiting from ever more collaborations and discussions with people in the Southeast Asian fields. And I think those kinds of cross-disciplinary discussions can help a lot. So this book project is going to be called Civilizing Missions and Colonialism in the Lands of Viet. Okay, so focusing around this kind of so-called Viet cultural region, which I guess we're still trying to figure out how we do this, but it would probably be in the Guangzhou areas, Guangxi, and down into the Red River areas of Vietnam, modern day Vietnam. And so for this talk, I wanted to problematize the concept of Sinicization and call it a hegemonic myth. And one of the problems I faced when I researched South China was that it was very clear that scholars who worked on the northern frontier, which they assumed was the more important frontier, so to speak, because that was where a lot of very, very intensive military interactions were occurring. People would kind of slough off the South and just assume and buy into a kind of hegemonic cultural myth that I think has been integral part of creating China as a state throughout, and a kind of concept throughout at least the second millennium. That Sinicization occurred. And of course, when the cultures from the north went down to these various regions in the south, all of the southerners, they were not very militaristic, and they just saw the light. It was almost like a Confucian paradigm of the sage, the sage ruler rules as the kind of pole star, and everybody else kind of revolves around him, or the sage ruler, the Junzi, can stand in the middle and is like the wind, and when the wind blows over the grass just bends, right? So this same kind of myth is transferred onto concepts of identity and the creation of a Chinese or a Huaxia identity, or throughout Chinese history. It's all throughout the texts. And this was kind of glommed onto in our very Western concept of Sinicization. It's basically an outgrowth of native-grown concepts of Sinicization in China to create the state. And create concepts and recreate concepts of state. It's also linked to the Confucian or the Zhou idea of ritual and propriety, the rites, and what is a kind of moral, almost a religion of that was constituted by certain kinds of practices associated with the rites and etiquette and things like that, and also with things associated with the Chinese languages and the Sinitic script. Now, oftentimes these different components of what it means to be Chinese are necessary, but not necessarily sufficient for all of this to be called Sinicization. So I'm going to go down and change this. So just to give you a sense of this myth of Sinicization, I think it's linked to a very native term called jiaohua, and I just came out with an article on the early history of this term. But it's not just jiaohua that is prevalent in the text. There are other things that involve educational this can be translated as educational transformation, and lihua can be translated as the transformation by the rights. Okay, so the idea is that you're transforming a whole people by using these kinds of apparatuses, these ritual apparatuses or these educational apparatuses. And this is closely linked to the idea of civilizing the other people. Okay, so everybody else, if they don't have these particular ritual practices and norms, they are uncivilized, and oftentimes that's translated as a kind of barbarian, the word barbarian. Okay, so this is an example from the Hohan Shu, the later Han history, that just gives us a sense of how the peoples of Jiaozhi were written about. They spoke utterly different languages. This resembled birds and beasts. They wore their hair in a top knot on the back of their head, covered it with cloth. They went barefoot, and they did not distinguish between the elders and the youth. And this is huge because that buys into kind of Confucian values of filial piety. So we're seeing a lot of things that are associated with Confucianism also being associated with civilization here. And so in this particular example, they use the word li hua, so culture change or ritual transformation, and they describe it almost as a natural outgrowth of just the very presence of Sinitic peoples in these hinterlands. So what they say is this particular example is so intriguing because it talks about convicts going into these regions, and the convicts convert the people just naturally because of their very presence. So they all start speaking the correct languages and using the rights. Okay. Now this is incredibly unbelievable for a historian like me, because we see that and we're like, how are they educating the local peoples? How is this transfer of culture happening when you're talking about convicts who really don't even care about the rights for the most part? The rights were a part of elite culture. And so there's something fishy going on here with these descriptions. So this is part of the writing about and the rhetoric about Sinicization or jiaohua. And it's a fallacy. It's just becoming Sinicized happens because of the very powerful presence of Chinese culture. So the story of China's southern frontier is often mistaken as a story of easy, and I might add to that, and lasting Sinicization. So the idea is it happened easily, and once it happened, it didn't go away. These places were just kind of remained China. And that is, in our book, I hope that we can really, stick it to that particular fallacy, because it is just not true. For the most part, you might have some periods of heavier colonization and forceful, coercive change, but sometimes those changes are lasting, and sometimes, especially in the first millennium, they are really not. So the question I'm interested in is, what is the nature of this, especially start with imperial reach in these frontier regions. And then what I'm interested in, because I like cultures and languages and things like that, I don't necessarily want to gauge economic change, because that's not something I study as much. But so I'm interested in asking, okay, if you have this colonization there, how is that going to affect culture change? And what are we going to be, how are we going to define culture change, basically? So today I have 3 case studies. I'm just going to kind of go quickly, because I think I spent a lot of time already in the background, on the background. These studies highlight these three different kind of techniques early on that we see in the Han era, the Han Empire era, of assimilationist politics, soft power enticements, and then actual civilizing missions that I think we can call bona fide as, or that they qualify as bona fide civilizing missions. So in terms of assimilationist politics, in the early Han period, they were struggling to hold the empire together. And so one thing that they did was to kind of extend this layer, keep the layer one that was the holdover from the Qin, the first empire period, but then revert, have this second layer and revert back to kind of a more feudal system of kingdoms that surrounded this, what we call the civilized bureaucracy, or the Junshen commandery system. And those all were incorporated a little more fully into the Han. But then you have this layer 3, and this is what I'm interested in with the Viet. These were satellite kingdoms that technically they had sometimes said that they were kingdoms, and in this layer 2, but oftentimes they really acted as completely autonomous powers, and didn't even pay attention to the very basic ritual structures that the Han would have liked for them to pay attention to. So here's a good map that gives you a sense of at least 2 of these layers. Over here in the west, near Chang'an, the capital of the Han, is the Junshen, or the more bureaucratized, centralized system. And then over here to the east and the south, you have more of the southern kingdoms, southern and other kingdoms that existed. And then here to the very south is what we're interested in. And these are the kingdoms of Nam Viet here in the south, covering the areas of Hong Kong, contemporary Hong Kong. Back then, Guangzhou was called Panyu, and going all the way down into northern Vietnam. This region was supposedly a part of this Nam Viet suzerainty. The Minyue over in the Fujian area is also referred to as as Yue, or Viet peoples and cultures. In 113 BCE, we have some interesting developments in which one of the more very young Han emperors is kind of forced to admit that he wants to be part of what we call a neishu, an inner member of the Han Empire. So a move towards more assimilation with the Han, more political connections. And what this meant, according to the texts, was that you'd have to remove the border controls between the Nam Viet and the Han, and that they would have to abolish the ancient laws of tattooing and cutting off criminals' noses and use certain Han laws instead. And this this king also vowed to act in accordance with the rights and the appropriate, which were appropriate to other inner lords of the Han era. Now, what happened was an all-out war, actually, because people in the kingdom of Nam Viet and certain elites, more kind of local nativist, with the nativist tendencies, revolted, and they ended up, the Han ended up having to send down a huge army of different armies of people coming in from the west, the north, the east, over here, and totally invading the city of the capital of Panyu, and basically razing it to the ground. You can see to this day in the remnants of the kingdom of the palace of Nam Viet, the actual charred remains on the canals that were associated with this kingdom, turtles, and you imagine this beautiful tropical paradise. It's not hard to imagine if you're living in Hawaii here, but with turtles coming up into this canal, into the palace canals and things, all of that razed to the ground and taken over in 111 BCE. And so the result of that is that even though we had these assimilationist policies that were desired by the one king towards the end there, they were not even accepted, and more extreme measures were taken so that the Han could take even greater control of the region. We also have soft power enticements that are happening about 100 years later. So this region now is in the Han a kind of commandery, a kind of province. It has a province and commandery system, thanks to the imperialist tendencies of Emperor Wudi that I just described with those those battles. And we see how people wanted to become inner members of, and how the Han wanted to have, just encroach on even groups that were even farther out than their nominal control with the administrative military apparatus that they would send down to these places. And so here are some people being described. They're not even of the Han yet, and they probably won't be for another 1,000 years, but they're in this region called beyond the border of Jiuzhen, okay, Kuchen in Vietnamese. And that was basically, I think, right, it is, I think it's the Hanoi region. Correct me if I'm wrong. Some people, I have to look exactly where this lay in relationship to the other commanderies. But these people outside of this region are trying to be enticed into the fold of the empire. And so these local chiefs they ordered the various peoples to respect and transform into inner members of the Han. So to become more inner members. Actually, they don't really. You can just see that all they're doing is there's some land that's being exchanged here, and then some rituals that are occurring, but there is no other word that any other kind of really integrative measures are being taken. But nonetheless, you have this interesting use of this concept of belonging to belonging to the inside. And I think that is it always changes with time. And I pay a lot of attention to that particular concept as well. So what is it? At its very base, it's a colonial process of managing these so-called non-hostile kingdoms or tribes in the borderlands by kind of enticing them to be and giving them, lands, giving them goodies, to be more a part of the feudal relationship with Han. And it involves ritual change and bestowal of titles and names, and that all of that would have changed. So there was a certain level of cultural change, but for the most part, it is an administrative thing. In the Eastern Han, we also have bona fide civilizing missions. In the ancient texts, they mention in Emperor Guangwu's reign, so around 25 is when he comes to power, 25 CE. These two officials, you can call them governors, Xi Guang and Ren Yan. They were the governors of these two places, Zaoji, Jiaozhi, and Kuchen. So Kuchen, Kuchen is slightly south of Zaoji, which is to the north and more in the realm of the Hanoi region, the Red River Delta today. So Kuchen is south of that, so really deep into what we would call contemporary Vietnam. So what they're doing are they're setting out these very established programs of jiaohua, or educational transformation, and these programs include changes in farming, so technology changes, ritual changes, and also manifesting oneself as a different identity, changing your headwear and your shoes, matchmaking and dowry customs. And even the whole concept of getting married is a kind of considered to be part of the civilizing mission. And this one is very interesting, establishing schools. There's something very, very, very standard about jiaohua, because it's called educational transformation. So at its very base is the notion that you can change people through education and through the building of schools. And so this is a very important aspect of this, of the colonial method used in East Asia. The commanderies here, I just wanted to point out their location. Shaoji is up here towards Hanoi, and then down here would be Jiuzhen. And then the very last one that is usually mentioned is called Rinan. And that's don't ask me what it's called in Vietnamese right now. I should look it up and get that. But it's also just, I mean, it's almost to covering the region around Hue and those areas. Okay, so I end on a civilizing mission that is more famous in history. It has to do with the Han general Ma Yuan, who was sent down to quell the rebellion of the Chong sisters. These Chong sisters become famous in Vietnamese history as the Hai Ba Chong, the two lady Chongs, two Chong ladies, and these are their names, Chong Chak and Chong Ni. So this one, it's very interesting to talk about these rebellions because we actually don't know that much about them from the actual sources, but they get remade throughout history, especially starting in the second millennium CE, when Vietnam is really coming into taking its place as a real political entity. The general is called Ma Yuan, and I just want to note that he's not the Ma Yuan of the Song era, who was a famous painter and famous for starting the Ma Xia school. Okay, so here on the left you have Ma Yuan and a statue to him in Hainan Island, and on the right a lovely picture of this great artist Ma Yuan, but not to be confused. So Ma Yuan, the general of the Han, he successfully overthrows the Chong sisters, and he sets about to reform this region. So this, I think, is a very paradigmatic civilizing mission, and it's described as such. Oh, by the way, the Chong sisters, the Hai Ba Chong, are predecessors to this grand figure of the 3rd century CE, Lady Chiu, who is another, female warrior figure that is one of the great heroes of Vietnamese history. So these are not insignificant episodes in history. So what does Ma Yuan do, though? He does the various things that I have listed here that include administrative control, the kind of streamlining and rationalizing of administrative control, but also technological achievements such as dredging canals, building infrastructure, irrigation networks. And it always says things, the texts are so interesting because they always throw in this rhetoric that this was good for the people. The pacification is a very good thing. They are benefiting the people, okay, Li Min, and they're also regulating and restraining them by giving them, order and peace, whereas the alternative was this chaos and this wild, untamed, uncivilized culture. And so those are very interesting to me. And also legal change, assimilated the US statutes. It's also a very integral part of these kinds of civilizing missions. So here I'm just giving you the classical Chinese, and the reason I highlighted the bold face here is this is where the rhetoric of pacification and the benefit and the easy Sinicization comes in, because they are benefiting the people. This is all a very good thing, and Chinese culture is being extended to these far out regions. When I look at Ma Yuan, even though he's considered to be a hero, even to the Vietnamese, which I think is really, really weird. How can you have Ma Yuan and the Chong sisters as your heroes at the same time? Because they were in battle against each other. And Ma Yuan represents everything that a colonialist and a mean colonialist and a very fierce one represents at that. So General Ma Yuan, he's a coercive colonialist, and that is very easily seen in the fact that he's taking some of the most valuable and revered symbols of political power and religious efficacy, which were the Yue bronze drums or the Viet bronze drums, He's grabbing these and he's melting them down and turning them into a statue of a horse, a bronze statue, to present to the emperor upon his return to the capital, which is then Luoyang and not Chang'an. Okay, so here is somebody completely destroying the local cultural artifacts and transforming them symbolically as well into that of the colonizer. So here's an example of a Dongson bronze drum. Dongson is the culture that is associated, the prehistoric cultures associated with the Vietnamese and the Yunnan and the regions around there, especially the coast. We find these bronze drums all over Southeast Asia and Indonesia, all over, not because these cultures existed in all these regions, but trade did. And so these bronze drums traveled. And then here is an example. It's not I don't have an example of the actual horse, the bronze horse that Ma Yuan cast for the emperor. But these are horses from the Han period that would give you a sense. And you just have to imagine, these are kind of tomb horses that would be put in a tomb for the afterlife. So you have to imagine that they're, 10 times the size and pretty monumental gift to the emperor. And now today, even in all of these regions in the south, in the maritime areas, Hainan Island, Vietnam, regions in Guangdong and Guangxi, you can find statues. Here's one in Guilin, okay, so southwest China, statues dedicated and kind of idolizing Ma Yuan as a local hero. Here's one from Hainan, okay, island, and not just it's talking about this. I think this is the stele for this statue that I just showed, and it shows today's perception of what Ma Yuan did and what a great role he played in developing the Hainan island and assimilating it into China, so to speak. So what was the extent of this of cultural change and colonialism in the Nam Viet areas? It's much more complicated than what I am able to present today for you, but in short, we have different periods and we see different techniques being used according to the period. In pre-11 BCE Nam Viet, that is when Nam Viet was almost its own independent state, we see that this colonization was pretty minimal, and that even to have better relations with the North, you had to kind of profess or make these proclamations that you're going to change some of your policies as a kind of prerequisite for that relationship. Post 111 BC, after the fall of the city of Panyu and the state of Nam Viet to the Han, the administrative control, of course, increased, but it's questionable as to the actual extent. And I think we're going to have to rely on archaeological, linguistic, other kinds of local sources that will basically tell a different picture. And I think what would be interesting, especially in this work, is to show that, the imperial reach was exceedingly limited. To get lands that were taxable, you didn't want to have a lot of incursions all the time. And that's what you would have had to do if you really had the entire polygonal space of what we show on a map. That is, this is Nam Viet, and we show this whole area. But actually the administrative control, we could think of it more as nested kind of hierarchies, linear branches instead of great polygons, okay? So was there Sinicization? Well, yes and no. But I would say for the most part, there was Sinicization, yes, but only in these kinds of areas that were relevant for the civilizing missions and these policies of Neishu or inner membership. And it does seem from the texts that we have that cultural change was a part of this package, this overall package of incorporation. But we also see from the record lots of rebellions and lots of struggles and lots of efforts to, to go around that. And so we have to keep an eye on the actual rhetoric of our texts and kind of read into them and not assume that what they're saying, oh, they just went down there and they pacified them easily. We can't assume that that was actually the case in reality. So what I want to end on is this sense that no, this was colonization. Indeed, it was. And the Han were very effective in many regions, just as the Romans were effective in colonizing London, right? And parts of England and parts of Germany. I was there in a region near Cologne where, you have, it's Cologne means colony. And so this was happening, but to say that it was, if it was colonized once, that it was always colonized, and that people always spoke a Sinitic language from then on, or they always maintained these customs, that's another question. And I think we really have to delve into the sources in more detail in order to figure that out. And that hopefully will be part of our book project. Obviously, we're going to be limited. We're both textual scholars, but we can work with people who are working on archaeology and linguistics and DNA and all sorts of different kinds of methods to read against the grain of the rhetorical texts and the myths that they perpetuate in trying to say that this was all China. So it's not this region. These are Vietic spaces. They're not Chinese. They're not Vietnamese. They are what they were. They are local cultures, and many of these local cultures differed drastically from one place to the next. So we just have to rethink this entire way of thinking about this history, and not according to nationalistic histories of East Asia versus or China versus Vietnam, or East Asia versus Southeast Asia, but rather this rubric that allows us to see the interconnections and the struggles and the changes of lots of different kinds of peoples, and not just the so-called Han. So I want to end there, and thank you very much for listening today. And I hope that this has opened up a lot of different questions for you.
Thank you so much, Professor Brindley. We have actually a couple of questions, but we want to now ask to invite Professor Wang Wensheng to give his comments and engage you in a brief dialogue before we move to the Q&A. Okay, Wensheng, please.
Thank you, Minbao. Thank you, Erica, for your very stimulating presentation, which gave us a lot to think about. I don't have much time today. In the next 15 minutes or so, I'd like to emphasize several questions while sharing my brief comments. I hope to provide more contextual background to better make sense of Erica's thoughtful presentation. So my presentation will be mostly from the Chinese perspective. As we all know, China is one of the oldest, largest, and most unified empires in world history. And Erica mentioned this very important question: why was China so big? And I would add two words: so big and so unified. This is a very intriguing question in the studies of Chinese history. Erica's presentation helped us better understand this question by examining a civilizing agenda that has been part of Chinese imperial statecraft for over 2,000 years. In discussing this, Eric addresses another major feature of Chinese history, this expansion toward the south. Most scholars agree that the Yellow River Valley was the cradle of Chinese civilization. After establishing itself in the north, the Chinese empire kept marching southward, reaching as far as nowadays Vietnam. More specifically, Erica discussed how the Han Dynasty tried to civilize the southernmost reaches of the empire, the newly conquered Viet kingdom. Before talking about this civilizing effort, I'd like to briefly discuss Jiaohua, a core concept in Chinese political philosophy that justified imperial expansion and civilizing impulse. Erica also mentioned this, talk a little bit about this term. I have the privilege of reading the article on which Erica's presentation is based. Her article discusses the early historical evolution of Jiaohua ideas and their implementation as borderland policy in the Viet region. What is Jiaohua? Erica translates it as educational transformation. It has a broad meaning that could be applied at many levels of society and government. In my opinion, Jiaohua refers to a wide range of efforts to educate, enlighten, and transform various peoples within and without the expanding Chinese empire. It goes beyond promoting self-cultivation of the individual, as we tend to interpret this term. It also aims to form good social customs, create a harmonious society, as well as a centralized and unified state. The essence of Jiaohua is to impose universal ritual, legal, and cultural requirements on a diverse population. It's not only a comprehensive project of leading people to morality and goodness, but also an all-encompassing art of governing that combines politics, social support, law, morality, religion, and education. So Jiaohua is not only an educational concept, but also a political, moral, and socializing concept. It could take place everywhere through a wide variety of means, including coercion, even though it's not a preferred one. The idea of Jiaohua originated and developed in the Zhou dynasty in the first millennium BC. Great thinkers like Confucius, Mencius, and also Xunzi tried to explain the possibility and necessity of Jiaohua based on their different understanding of human nature. The implementation of Jiaohua as a state policy mainly started from the unified Qin-Han dynasties and ran through the whole imperial period. Erica stresses the importance of the Han dynasty because it was during this period that Jiaohua represent a pragmatic strategy of imperial control and expansion that propagated a unified, civilized culture throughout the empire. The second question I'd like to talk about is Jiaohua as a kind of civilizing mission. I agree with Erica on this point. Meanwhile, it's necessary to mention that the very concept civilizing mission derived from the modern European expansion toward non-European territories. So we need to understand the major differences between Chinese Jiaohua and Western civilizing mission. Here, I only have time to stress one key difference. When it comes to European civilizing mission in the 19th and early 20th centuries, racism is the basic foundation and major incentive. Essentially, it means that some races are superior to others due to their innate genetic superiority, which is considered unchangeable. And the inferior races need to be treated with different standards. This is a very different kind of ethnocentrism from the Chinese kind, which was based on the notion that China, the so-called Middle Kingdom, Zhongguo, was the center of the civilized world. According to the Confucian view of the world, anyone who has good sense and is given the chance will become Chinese by adopting this superior culture through Jiaohua. So up until the Opium War, Chineseness was never a racial concept, but a cultural one which offers much more flexibility. As Erica rightly suggests in her article, conceptualization of ethnic distinction in early China was not based on kinship ties, but on cultural identification. And she mentioned Huaxia, let's take Huaxia as an example because it has become a representation of the Chinese state and civilization. Huaxia refers to the ancestors of what later became the dominant Han ethnic group in China. More specifically, it's the collection of many different ethnic groups that practiced ritual morality of the Zhou dynasty, talking about the ritual transformation, and also institutionalize it in various forms. To better understand this, it's necessary to explain the dominant Chinese way of thinking about the world, which was very different from the Western one. In the case of early modern and modern Europe, the state has been understood as a sovereign system of government that monopolizes coercion within a particular territory. It claims supreme power of governance within well-defined boundaries using important means like wars, diplomacy, and maps to endorse such assertions. Seen from this perspective, state power has become an independent, absolute, and impersonal condition, a tool that exists regardless of whether the rulers use it for good or evil. If, for instance, I ask you where the sovereignty of US ends and where the sovereignty of Canada begins, anyone who can read a map, as you can see from this map on my wall, can give me the exactly same answer. And that answer doesn't depend on whether you think President Obama or Trump is great or not. By contrast, state power in traditional China was very different. It was the emperor's universalistic claim of ruling all under heaven, 天下, justified by the mandate of heaven, 天命, which can be revoked if he or she was a lousy ruler. So state power cannot be separated from the ruler's moral authority and the benevolent leadership. So rather than being represented by a clearly demarcated line, territorial space on the map, state power in China was like the area lit up by a torch in a dark open field. How big the lit area is depends on how bright the torch is. Furthermore, this area ends not at a sharp line, but in a gradual fading out. Similarly, traditional China did not end at any clear point or boundary, but extended to wherever people accepted and practiced the Confucian way of living. So China's international order was an extension of its domestic order based on Confucian values along a continuum that recognized flexible cultural zones more than rigid political borders. Meanwhile, the Middle Kingdom developed a strong identity as an all-inclusive civilization capable of converting or absorbing people from near and far as long as they acknowledge the superiority of the Chinese culture. So as Erica points out, Jiaohua should be understood as a tool for this great enterprise, a sort of civilizing mission of spreading Huaxia civilization to marginal cultures and peoples. This strong sense of cultural responsibility and ethnic identity had played a great role in the building of Chinese empire. They were the key unifying factors throughout China's long history, even during times when the agrarian empire was divided or taken over by nomadic invaders like Mongols and Manchus. Just in this sense, some people argue that traditional China was not a conventional state, but a civilizational one that could subsume vast regions and diverse peoples. This was largely done through Jiaohua, which means providing all sorts of civilizing goodies like cultural blessings, favorable trading opportunities, political investitures, and even military protection. Of course, coercion was often used in this kind of process. In general, the Chinese had envisioned a self-centered universe consisting of a series of concentric circles. the actual control of which decreased progressively away from the civilizing core, the Chinese capital, giving Vietnam's geographical proximity and historical ties to China. In general, it plays a very important role in this Sinocentric world order. And in the next several minutes, I'd like to briefly discuss the Sino-Vietnamese interaction. Erica's presentation focused on the first era of Chinese domination, when nowadays Northern Vietnam first came under Han dynastic rule. As she mentions, in 111 BC, the powerful Chinese Han dynasty conquered the non-Viet kingdom during its expansion southward and incorporated Northern Vietnam together with much of China's modern Guangdong and Guangxi provinces into the expanding Han Empire. Interestingly, this non-Viet kingdom was founded by a Qing dynasty general called Zhao Tuo. And this, ironically, this non-Viet kingdom has been considered the first historically proven predecessor state of Vietnam, with its political center in nowadays Guangzhou city. If you go to this city, you can find a big museum about the ancient non-Viet kingdom. I don't know how many Vietnamese have visited this museum, but imagine how complicated their feelings must be. So to understand the development of Vietnamese identity or Viet identity, we need to consider the relations with the northern neighbor. Some people argue that the development of Vietnamese history and identity was largely affected by the contradictory yet interrelated process of Sinicization and de-Sinicization. Erica just challenged and complicated this Sinicization model, but I was wondering if you, can talk about the interaction between these two trends, this assimilation or acculturation toward Chinese, and this strong tendency of preserving their native traditions, and represented by the Chang sister rebellions. And how did these two contradictory processes and tendencies play out in the ancient period of Chinese domination you talk about here? And okay, I'll stop here. And if I have time, I will, pose more questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Wensheng, for this good discussion. Erica, can we ask you to come back? Because we actually have a number of questions. Do you want to briefly respond a couple of minutes to Wensheng? Because we do have actually about 10 questions. Mm-hmm.
Oh, sure. I will just briefly, because I love questions from the audience. So that was very, very beautifully stated, Wensheng, and thank you very much for that presentation that really put things into perspective. My one thing, though, is that this was a very Sinocentric type of presentation, because I don't even think of the South in China at that time as necessarily China. And so I think with that starting point, I think we need to break it all down a little further and not buy into this idea that Sinicization was really, really so effective in this period. Certainly it was effective in certain areas. But those areas were circumscribed, and they were considerably much smaller than what we would probably imagine, because we like to imagine things in terms of polygons, states, nation states. And this is not at all what the landscape back then looked like. Instead, I propose that we change our perspectives entirely and think about what these places might have seemed like to the peoples there at the time. And so even in the medieval period, after the Han has fallen, you're going to have peoples in the Vietnamese region of Hanoi, for example, who are seeing themselves as, you know, politically, they might not even know who the leaders are. But if they are, then they're the local leaders, and some of those local leaders are not even part of a larger China. In fact, they're just part of the Wu Empire in the south, or later what Andrew Chittick has called the Jiankang Empire. And even with the Jiankang Empire, those farther southern, more southern reaches of that Jiankang periphery might not have even considered themselves to be part of the Jiankang areas. So to think of that as all China, I think is going to get us into trouble when we work on this particular period. So that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, let's take some of the questions. Here's a general question. It's formulated in general terms, but maybe you can sort of more answer it in the context of the material that you were talking about. This is this. What is the relationship between ideas of peoplehood and states? That is, do states turn people that they rule over into people, replete with a singular name? Is there any evidence of the existence of quote unquote people before they come to be civilized by states?
I'm trying to think of what this person means by people. Just human beings, or kind of a grouping of people? Are they?
Maybe it's, yeah, maybe because you know, it's your presentation focused on this sort of civilizing mission, right? With the understanding, unless you're civilized, you don't have full personhood, right? And so I think it's maybe direct in that direction.
Oh, personhood in that sense. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I would say that these people very much thought of themselves as people and as persons, and they had their own kind of personhood. It was a different culture. They didn't necessarily, what this whole civilizing mission rhetoric, what the rhetoric does is it's only from a certain elite perspective coming from farther north. It's not necessarily what the local people thought at all about themselves. And in fact, I think, you know, maybe some migrants from the north who were part of and much more connected to this culture from the north and the political apparatus that was associated with it, they definitely would have seen themselves as, well, we aspire to be persons in this more Huaxia sense, that kind of, you know, we want to be civilized, we want to adopt these rights, we want to seem, and what's interesting is sometimes the local native tradition peoples also saw that as a good thing. And they didn't necessarily see it as losing their own cultural values that we might see it today as, but they saw it as entering into a felicitous kind of social status, you know, getting another social status, speaking a Sinitic language, perhaps, kind of connecting into this larger realm of what we might call, and Kate Baldanza has talked about this for the Ming period, and I think it's a very handy term, the classical culture, the culture of classical learning. It doesn't mean that you're Chinese. Japanese people were a part of this culture of classical learning. People wanted to be a part of it. They would write poems in the same kinds of styles. Similarly, in Korean Peninsula, down in Vietnam, all of these peoples entering into this more larger classical culture as a kind of status move. Okay, and so in that sense, there were people transforming themselves willingly because of the enticement and the great some material benefits that went with that kind of cultural capital. Does that make sense?
Yes, since you mentioned, I think you answered the next question actually, that actually ask about the role of the elites. And this comes from Miriam Stark. She says, earlier Southeast Asian historians emphasized the role of elites in embracing the Indic cultural traditions in early Southeast Asia. Do you think these elites in these regions, like in Jiaozhi, may have welcomed Chinese ideas in order to promote their own agenda? And I think you just sort of answered that question.
That's absolutely happening. And I think this is an important dynamic that has to be highlighted in the book that we're going to be writing, is that there's this sense of, again, it's not just colonialism coming down and with a horse, you know, like Ma Yuan, but there's this sense that it is desirable for elites of these various cultures who are hybridize themselves. And in certain situations, they will be part of their own local cultures. And in other situations, you know, they'll turn around and write poems in literary Sinitic. And so absolutely it's part of, so oftentimes what scholars do, and they make a really treacherous mistake, and it's to look at, say, a poem that's written in literary Sinitic and say, this is Chinese. Well, no, not at all. There's so many stories behind this. It just, because it's using this technology of the classical learning, doesn't mean that the identities on the ground and the relationships were about becoming Chinese at all. It's just, it looks like that from today's perspective because we lump everything together in this monolithic way. But back then, I think that's an important dynamic, it was desirable that these cultural, this was cultural capital, valuable cultural capital. And so were the ritual titles that were being bestowed. In one of my examples, you know, you're taking these kind of so-called untamed people and you're giving their leaders a special tract of land, you know, a title, and you're saying, work with us, right? I'll give you a Chinese name even. That person was not necessarily Chinese, but they are starting the process of becoming so-called Chinese. And maybe, you know, in 2 generations, their particular descendants might really identify more with this kind of Northern cultural sphere. So that's an important aspect of this process. And I don't have a name for that process. I guess it's the acquiring the eager and willing acquisition of cultural capital by elites, you know, in various regions, local elites.
I think, you know, we have here a sort of, I can comment or question about this process of Sinicization, right? Wouldn't it also be worth reminding us, I think, which you just did, that culture innovation went both ways. For example, Viet metallurgy went north, so did crossbow in boat technologies, etc. Right? So I think that sort of confirms what you just said, right?
There are so many influences from the South that get basically lumped into what is now just called China. And so I think one of the great things about studying this early period, when it is not China, is that you can really, well, there are pros and cons. One thing is you just don't have enough information, but if you can piece together that information, then you really see a much more diverse picture where certain things that we now call stereotypically Chinese were actually not at all Chinese, and they were from the South, and you know, and from these other what we might call Southeast Asian cultures that are, you know, just they've been forgotten.
We have an interesting question here from Barbara Andaya. She says, in the reign of Emperor Guangwu, you reference the changes to headwear and shoes. Bare feet recur repeatedly in depictions of Southeast Asian people as a sign of inferiority by Europeans as well, right? Why was this so significant in Chinese culture? And I'm thinking of Martha Challen's article on the importance of the shoes in Japanese culture. That's a comment from Barbara. Clothing also recurs as a motif of civilization much later on, for example, in the Miao albums.
That's a fantastic question. Thank you so much for that. I have some chapters in my book on the Viet that talk about the tropes of the other, and especially the Viet peoples, as you know, the tattooing of the body. So not just not wearing clothes, because they were often naked because they were showing their tattoos, but being naked. So nakedness and tattoos and then certain clothing styles. It's one of the big things in my period for Confucius, it actually occurs in the Analects itself, is that you want to button your robe from a certain side. And if you button it from the other side, that means you're not Chinese. I mean, you're not Huaxia. It's a clear signal to them. And so there were definitely clothing, appropriate clothing to wear that showed that you were part of this ritual Zhou culture. And Confucius and his disciples really believed that you kind of had to adopt these particular rituals and this particular clothing in order to become a part of that larger cultural society. And so in terms of headwear and shoes, oh wow, that I have a whole section on the top knot, which I think it gets mixed in with all different kinds of peoples, not just the Viet. And it goes to show you that some of these tropes were really just tropes that they threw out there, and they didn't even know who they were talking about. I mean, this just goes to show you how a lot of these authors had no clue what they might not have ever traveled to some of these places. And some of them, when you do get somebody who's lived in those local regions, then you get much more interesting information. But when you get these kinds of things being repeated over and over, like the top knot, the mallet shaped headwear, and then for the Viet, it's also the long dangling hair, because you're not putting your hair up and wearing the kind of conical hat that was so iconic of the Sinitic, early Sinitic cultures. So that's super interesting that headwear is always from really early on in Chinese history a big deal. You know, how you're wearing your hair, and all over the ancient texts in the Warring States period, the BCE period that I used to work on as well. And also, you know, just think about the Manchus. Right. You know, this was a very big sign of, you know, wearing the queue and forcing this on people in the Qing era. I mean, Wensheng would know about this, but that goes to show you again that this kind of emphasis on the head doesn't change. Shoes, I'm not as good at, but I'll look into that. So thank you.
Can I jump in for a minute?
Yes.
Very good question. I think we are talking about the cultural system, and the process of, you know, cultural interaction can happen at different levels. And cultural system consisted of many different nails. The outermost nail is material changes and, you know, clothing, food. And the middle nail is the institution and the ritual. And the innermost layer is the value, basic assumption and value system. So when the Chinese, the Han Empire, began to colonize the Viet region, of course, they start with the easiest one, the material changes, and followed by some institutional changes. So this is a big deal. I want to emphasize that this kind of change is not just one way. Okay, Chinese change everything, you know, non-Chinese people's custom. And Erica just mentioned Manchus. As we all know, Tang Zhuang and the Qipao, Changsang, they are Manchu clothing. They now become the national costume of China, okay? So it's a very complicated process. It can go many different directions. And yes, Sinicization model simplify things, but I think it still has some value because it represents one very important change that shaped the relationship between different groups of people. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, let's take two more questions about the direction of expansion. One from Tuyen Lam. It says, any explanation as to how the Yue became an integral part of the Han Empire, yet the Viet king did not? Is it just geography? And then I think another question along the same line by Miriam Stargus. We Southeast Asianists are curious about why China marched southward so vigorously, and whether it was the lure of the tropical goods that formed elite items for the Chinese, from aromatic woods to medicinal and so on. Is it too economic of an argument? So that's about why they went southward. And the question earlier, why did Viet become such an integral part, but not this other area, right? This what this person calls the let's see again, where is it? The Viet Kinh area. So it says, why did Yue become such an integral part of the Han Empire, yet the Viet Kinh K-I-N-H did not? Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'm going to answer the second one first. Now I'm forgetting. Oh, the marching of Sinitic cultural influences southward. This comes from a very important book, Harold Wien's, and the march of the Chinese southward into the tropics or something like that. It's a trope that I think is very powerful because it does, you can actually picture people like getting up and going, moving, and in many ways, there's a lot to it because people were migrating. I think one of the things that we forget that's happening is that this history is so much in flux, and it's so dependent as well on what's happening along the northern frontiers of China. And when these different relationships on the northern frontier are changing, and there's a lot of conquest up there in the Central Plains regions, then a lot of people are being displaced. And where is that displacement going for these populations? So demography changes completely with periodic and also gradual influxes from the north into the southern regions. And so with these people seeking out a better life, and taking haven in some of the pre-existing kind of administrative regions that were more familiar to them, they're starting to expand, and a lot of expand their influence. And so yeah, there is a sense of a march but I would call that migration. And I wouldn't say that it's only because they wanted the tropical goods and they wanted to live in a good tropical area, although, hey, the tropics are really very enticing, right? But there were all, if you look at the literature of the poetry of the Tang, for example, when they are exiled, these officials exiled to the south, it's not considered to be an ideal place by the elite. So I think it's more like regular people who are traders and merchants and farmers and all of these peoples, when they are being a lot of people gradually moving southward for economic reasons, but because lands are being opened up in an administrative way, but also this is a region that was considered by elites to be undesirable because it was infested with a kind of qi, a kind of bad qi that, now we would call, it's malarial ridden. But back then it was associated with, it's just these kind of not infectious lands, but the miasmic is one of the words that one of my colleagues, Kate Baldanza, is using, the miasma of the South, okay? So that's a very interesting idea. I don't think it's just because, of the goods, but there's so many other factors, economic, military, and migratory.
I'd like to add one more point to explain why this southward expansion is important, because it supports the emperor's claim of ruling all under heaven. It can elicit outsider submission to Chinese overlordship. So all this comes together in this Tianxia ideology. Okay, that's the political significance of this kind of expansion, even though economic benefit was not very obvious during this period. Mm-hmm. It became more and more obvious with the population explosion in later Chinese history. And also the northern frontier was very, very tough, okay? You have those very dangerous nomadic people. It is impossible to fight them. But southward migration, relatively, you are fighting different minority groups, even though it's very tough terrain, but in comparison with the northern nomadic challengers, it is a relatively easier job.
Right, the military traditions in the South were not as developed and strong as those from the kind of steppe regions of the North, where that was the predominant mode of life for a lot of them. You're riding a horse. If you're riding a horse at age 2 or 3.
Very interestingly, we know much more about the northern frontier because people study it a lot, but not very much is known about the southern frontier. Mm-hmm. And which makes your research even more important.
Great. We have time for one more question. Actually, it's for Wensheng, but I would like to hear what Erica has to think about it. This is from Nandita Sharma. How is Professor Wang understanding the idea of race, quote unquote, right? If broadly taken, it is a way of thinking that categorizes people as different types of people. The factor of difference could be anything in the Chinese Empire. People certainly were differentiated as more or less, or non-civilized. This can also be understood as a process of racialization to elevate the rulers and legitimize their rule.
This is a good question. I think it's also related to the very first question about peoplehood.
Yes.
So we are historians, we study people, and there are so many different ways to differentiate them. And race, ethnic groups, nowadays class, state, you name it. But those categories are not necessarily what people at certain time were using to understand themselves. So race, I don't think is a very important concept in the Chinese traditional philosophy because Chinese emphasize acculturation or sinicization. No matter what racial group, even though they don't use this term race, no matter what background you're from, which part of the world are you from, as long as you understand the Confucian core values and teachings, you live the Chinese way, eat the Chinese way, marry the Chinese way, you are considered a part of the Chinese community. Even the world conquering Mongols, when they came to conquer China and control China, they have to step out of their saddle and rule in the Chinese way. Otherwise, there is no way they can control this place. So that's the reason why Chinese culture become the only continuous civilization, major civilization in world history. So because this quintessential Confucian teaching and the bureaucratic centralized political system continued on and on throughout imperial period. As for the racial understanding of being Chinese, it is a relatively recent phenomenon. It became more and more important after the Opium War, when the Han Chinese began to question, what's wrong with those Manchus? You are selling out the country to the red-haired barbarians, and oh, you are not Chinese. That's the reason you are selling us out. You are the traitors. So that led to Sun Yat-sen's revolution. 驱除鞑虏,恢复中华, restore China by driving out the barbarians. Right. That's a racialization, which in accordance with the social Darwinism and the rise of nation state in modern history. But it's not a Chinese tradition.
Okay, Erica, very quickly, we have 1 minute left. Do you want to respond?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. While there isn't this concept of race, I agree very much with Wensheng on that. There are a plethora of evolving ethnocentric concepts throughout Chinese history. And so there's a lot of literature also written on these ethnocentric concepts of Huaxia or Han or things like that. And so, so skin color wasn't an area of that was very important, but culture was, right? As Wensheng was saying, but also things like, I'm trying to think quickly because I know we're out of time, but it was not skin color, but there were some innate based things that were not completely innocent. So there was environmental determinism. Like if you were born in this particular region, then you have this certain kind of chi that influences you and you are bad, you're barbaric, you have these naturally wild tendencies. So there were ethnocentric kind of more innate propensities, determined propensities to that might be seen as a kind of racism, but definitely not skin color racism in the same sense that developed later on in history in the West.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. There were some other questions, but we have a record of these questions, and I want to apologize to the audience we didn't get to it, but we'll make sure that our speakers will receive them. So I want to thank Professors Brindley and Wang Wensheng very much for sharing today with us their expertise and their research. It was a very interesting and very stimulating conversation they had. Many thanks to our audience, right, for their submitting so many interesting questions. And before everybody leaves, I'd like to remind you of our event next Wednesday, March 10, which is featured as a faculty presentation and panel discussion on the topic Sinophone articulations across the borderlands with Professors Brian Bernard from the US-China Institute at USC and E.K. Tan, Department of English from Stony Brook University. So with that, again, thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you next week. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.